The Polish-Lithuanian Empire was once the dominant Eastern European power for roughly a century, at their peak even overrunning Russia. But it then entered decline. The Ottomans entrenched themselves in the south, the Rus had formed a powerful tsardom, and even the Swedes were attempting to consolidate themselves around the Baltic Sea. Due to their geographic position, Poland found itself at the center of most of this fighting. Their once proud kingdom now being fought over by their rivals. By the 1700s, it became increasingly clear that it would be the Russians which would win the struggle for Eastern Europe. Increasingly, Russia began to see Poland as little more than a satellite state, stuck in political limbo due to their peculiar system of aristocracy, in which individual nobles could veto most reforms, something easily exploited by foreign threats and money to keep Poland weak and divided. This situation may have continued for a while, but the ideals of the Enlightenment were spreading, and the Polish king and nobles were not content with their position. Some nobles seeking even further autonomy, while others dreamt of Polish reform and revival, thereby threatening Russia's hegemony over the state. Beyond that, Russia was having major success in wars against the Ottomans, while at the same time the Austrian Empire wasn't. As such, an Austro-Russian war seemed to be brewing, and to prevent the destabilization of the region, Frederick the Great came with a suggestion. Why don't we carve up the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth instead? At this time, a pro-reform uprising in Poland had just been defeated by Russian troops, making Poland near powerless to resist. So, each of the neighboring powers took their first share of the Polish partition, with Austria receiving the most populous part to balance against Russia's conquests in Crimea. For about 2 decades, Poland held steady like this, until the French Revolution shocked the great powers of Europe, and found supporters in Poland. Weary of a revolution, Prussia and Russia once more carved out large chunks of Poland. In 1794, a Polish uprising actually did manifest, and soon after, foreign troops again entered Poland, and the nation was partitioned like this. These borders held for about a decade, until Napoleon revived a Polish state out of Prussian territories, and then expanded it at the expense of Austria. But then, Napoleon got defeated, and Europe could now be completely redrawn, with Prussia, Russia and Austria each amongst the victorious powers. Thus, it might seem logical for them to simply return to the borders they had previously agreed to. But that is not at all what happened. Tsar Alexander of Russia was very clear at the Congress of Vienna that he sought Poland as compensation for his nation's efforts against France. At some point, he had even suggested gaining the Prussian and Austrian parts of Poland fully, though it is possible this was just a negotiating tactic, allowing him to graciously back down to a middle point later. Now, the Polish question became one of the most heavily debated at the Congress of Vienna, and I highly recommend checking out Historia Civilis' videos on it. But basically, Russia wanted to control as much of Poland as possible. Austria was concerned about Russian expansionism and had hoped to create an independent Poland, even open to expanding it with Austrian territory so it could be a strong buffer state. France and Britain were less directly concerned, but generally favored Poland as a buffer state. Prussia simply wanted more territory, and as such were open to keeping Polish territory, but conversely were happy to give it up in exchange for massive expansions in Germany itself. In this light, it becomes clear why the borders of the Third Partition weren't kept after the Congress of Vienna. It seemed that none of the great powers was actually all too interested in preserving those borders, and Russia, by virtue of having the most powerful army of the continent, had quite some leverage at this conference. So this alternate division was agreed upon, with Russia gaining most of Poland, though notably officially under a separate Kingdom of Poland, with a liberal constitution meant to partially protect the Polish people, but mostly meant to serve to annoy the conservative Russia. In the decades following, the Polish people were systematically oppressed in all 3 states. Russia attempted to suppress their culture and Russify them, Prussia suppressed their culture and Germanized them, and Austria, the most lenient, tried for decades to Germanize their empire, and only when this failed did the Galician Poles get better rights and autonomy. But what if all that had changed? What if, somehow, at the Congress of Vienna, Tsar Alexander found himself completely outwitted by the others, the four great powers drawing a red line over Poland, presenting a united front, and giving the Tsar just two options. Either the restoration of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to stand as a buffer between the Eastern powers, or the borders of the Third Partition restored, strengthening Prussia and Austria against the Russians. Now, this would be very difficult to achieve. Russia had set their sights on Poland, and their demands were not wholly unreasonable from a great power perspective. They had been the ones to bleed out the massive French Grande Armée. They had the most powerful army on the continent, and they had captured Paris. Tsar Alexander also thought that Poland was crucial for the security of his throne, fearing he may be overthrown by his own nobles. So aside from all four powers directly threatening war, I can't really see a way to get Russia to back down in any way. There is little other territory the Congress can give which Russia would be interested in. They had already conquered Finland, Sweden was part of the coalition, and not really territory Russia was interested in, and while Russia would have been interested in Turkish territory, the Ottomans had been neutral, and the great powers, especially Britain, may have been more scared of a Russia pushing towards Constantinople than one controlling Poland. So for the sake of this scenario, we will assume the final war with Napoleon is even more destructive on Russia. Their negotiating position at the Congress is reduced, and a unified show of force is enough for Alexander to reluctantly give in to avoid war. The borders of the Third Partition are re-established. Quite possibly, this also has an effect on Prussian expansion into Saxony. Prussia had sought to achieve long-standing ambitions on Saxony, but the Austrian Emperor and smaller German states preferred an independent Saxony, and Prussia in the end only got half, as compensation for the Poland territory they gave up. With Prussia keeping those Polish territories, a larger Saxony may likewise survive. This is not an insane change, but Saxony was valuable industrially, and they will more than likely be in the Austrian sphere of influence, which through their position improves Austria's defense and weakens Prussia's strategic depth. It's not a radical change, but it does bear mentioning. So with that, we settle into the new reality in Europe. And on the surface, these changes seem pretty minor. But I can tell you that this is one of the hardest scenarios I've written recently. This scenario changes enough that quite possibly all of the 19th century as we know it could be butterflied away. Yet, it doesn't change so much that it is obvious what it may change into. So in this video, I will present you a number of factors which may shape the scenario, rather than offering a concrete, this is what I think would have happened. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now the first and most fundamental question of this alternate history is just how upset Russia is. This references both the humiliations of Russia and how they might interact with the great powers going forward, as well as how true Alexander's remarks at the Congress were about the risk of him being overthrown. Is he indeed cowed by his own nobles, or is his reign weakened going forwards? If he does remain in power, is his foreign policy impacted in the long term? If we try to remove emotion from the equation, the Polish territories really weren't that valuable to the Russian Empire. Their constitution hampered their early reign, and as we will soon discuss, the Poles had several major uprisings. If looked at soberly, the loss of Poland really isn't that much of a disaster for this alternate Russia. So the first option is that Russia, perhaps after a couple of years, relaxes. They arrive at the same conclusion, and decide that it is more important to maintain the new balance of power in Europe, even if they aren't fully happy with it. They commit to maintaining the hegemony of the monarchy, and relations with Prussia and Austria heal. In such a case, the changes to this timeline may remain more subtle, with the changes focusing on under-the-surface events in the politics and priorities of the individual states. But if Russia does remain embittered, we have quite some plausible changes, leading to divisions between the great powers which on paper have the most in common. Alliances like the Holy League, where the conservative powers agreed to jointly combat liberalism and revolutions across Europe, may never happen. Russia may even start looking to weaken their perceived German rivals. It's even possible that the Poles, now under less Russian occupation, start looking towards Russia as their possible liberator from German rule, just like the Czechs in our timeline, with Poland being a more voluntary party to a pan-Slavic movement. Of course, this would be far from guaranteed. Russian-Polish tension has existed for far longer than just the occupation of 1815. So even with the Russians not occupying Poland directly, there would still be more distrust between Poles and Russia than Czechs and Russia. Yet over decades of German rule, a more positive relation developing is not impossible. Then, if Alexander does indeed face a coup, or even an assassination, as had befallen his father, we might see the power of the Russian Tsar weakened, as the nobles once more imprint their will upon the crown and state. Generally, the Russian nobles were more conservative than their monarchs, meaning we could get an even more reactionary Russia in this timeline, with the monarchs having less control over their nation, especially if Tsar Constantine is installed after Alexander, as he had little interest in politics. Then I think it's important to dedicate some time to the fate of the Poles within our timeline's Russia, Prussia and Austria, so we can hypothesize their treatment in this alternate timeline. Now, starting with Russia, I think you'll already know that it was pretty bad. The official liberal constitution and official separation from Russia as a separate kingdom revealed itself to be a farce very quickly. Tsar Alexander worked to hollow out Polish autonomy during his reign, while Duke Constantine, serving as his viceroy, stamped down on liberal opposition and constitutional freedoms, bringing in Russians to fill important positions rather than Poles. In 1830, these tensions would lead to the Poles launching a rather impressive revolution, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides facing off, before eventually the Russians succeeded in restoring their rule. Afterwards, any semblance of Polish autonomy was abolished. Russia further intensified their suppression and Russification, universities were closed, education and the press were further limited, and many prominent Polish statesmen, authors and leaders emigrated, primarily to France. The Catholic Church and the Polish language were both also suppressed, and Warsaw was commonly referred to as nothing but a Russian military camp. I could go on and on about how Russia mistreated the region. It did get slightly better over time, but meaningful reform only came after a Polish uprising in 1905, combined with broader revolutions across Russia. Though of course, by this point it was too late, and Polish hatred against Russia had been well entrenched. In light of this, it is difficult to imagine this alternate history being worse for Poland. Yet, we mustn't overestimate this fact. Their rights and existence will still be threatened by their new masters. Within the Prussian portion of Poland, Poznan, the Poles likewise officially had autonomy, but once more, in practice this was largely ignored and even abolished. And in this alternate timeline, it is not guaranteed Prussia also has to establish an autonomous kingdom of Poland, as Russia had done in our timeline. After all, this was forced upon Russia in an attempt to weaken the behemoth, but forcing it upon Prussia, who in 1815 was absolutely the weakest of the great powers, would risk its destabilization, which could prove disastrous for the balance of power within Europe. Besides, Austria and Russia may object to Prussia, at least officially, gaining claims across their territories. So I would expect these Polish territories to simply become provinces of the Kingdom of Prussia. When Prussia initially got the territories in the 1790s, they immediately started Germanization policies. The Polish economy was exploited for Prussia's gain, and despite the Poles making up a very significant percentage of Prussia's population, there wasn't some homegrown Prussian idea that the Poles should be treated well or be given autonomy. Even this early on, Prussia was set on anti-Polish, anti-Catholic policies, and I see no reason why this would be different after regaining the territory in 1815. If anything, the increased Polish population may cement to the Prussian government that suppression and Germanization is even more important to ensure the Poles don't destabilize the Prussian kingdom. But there are potential upsides. Prussian suppression is still less brutal than the Russian one. The Polish economy, while underfunded and made subservient to the Prussian one, will still likely grow faster than the historical economy of Russian Poland. Absolutely, within Prussia, and perhaps later Germany, Poland would be the poorest region by far. But due to Prussia's higher industrialization overall, this would still likely make Prussian Poland towards the richer end of Eastern Europe. Of course, this in no way is compensation for the Polish lack of freedom. Assuming Prussia holds on to Poland in the long term, efforts to destroy the Polish identity in full would fail. Yet compared to our timeline, the Prussians may still be more successful exactly because they have more of Poland. It might be possible the Prussians start to move the Poles further inwards, something that wasn't possible historically, as Russia wouldn't have liked hundreds of thousands of displaced Poles being forced into their territory. The Prussians may succeed in pushing the ethnic line in their favor, continually redefining Poland as a narrower and narrower area within Prussia. Within Austria, the Poles would, over time, find their most hospitable conqueror. They too attempted Germanization, primarily through the standardization of language in education and government. But, through the resistance of the empire's many minorities, this failed and backfired, primarily strengthening minority languages and identities. So, over time, such efforts ended, and after a failed Polish uprising, the Austrians gave more autonomy to the Poles and Ruthenians of Galicia. Compared to Russian and Prussian Poland, this is where Polish art and literature flourished the most. More than likely, this will happen in this timeline as well, with the Kingdom of Galicia-Lodomeria being the second largest territory of the empire, only behind the Kingdom of Hungary itself. The Poles are now also the third biggest ethnic group, behind only the Germans and Hungarians. The Western Slavs, including the Poles, Czechs and Slovaks, now make up about 30% of the population of the empire. If a third crown is ever to be considered for this alternate Austrian empire, undoubtedly Galicia would be the prime contender. All of the things discussed up to this point are important, mostly for the status of the Polish people, but also geopolitically, as the real crux of this scenario, where it can breach into a billion directions, are the revolutionary years which rocked Europe and Poland in the mid-1800s, specifically 1830 against Russia, 1846 against Austria, 1848 against Prussia, and 1864 against Russia again. Historically, all of these revolts were unsuccessful, and the great powers supported each other against the Poles, as none desired a Polish national revival. But great powers relations aren't necessarily the same in this timeline, with Russia's attitude towards Germanic power being the most instructive. They now don't own all too significant Polish territories, and may be far less committed to the concert of Europe and the post-Napoleonic world order. Russia could swiftly become the most destabilizing force in Europe, and may well support, or at least condone, a Polish revolution against Prussia whenever it manifests. Of course, this already has a lot of variation in outcomes, depending on when the revolt happens, how directly Russia supports it, and how successful it is at getting an initial foothold. Also, whether or not other powers jump in on either side. We may even see this becoming something akin to the Crimean War, with some Western powers intervening to try and save Prussia or weaken Russia. A timeline where Russia is successful in weakening Prussia we will discuss later, as I think it is best coupled with a different event. But the idea of this alternate war against Russia, which Russia is very likely to be on the losing end of, is also interesting. Now, the victory of the coalition obviously immediately reverses any sort of Polish independence, and if history is to be followed, Prussia treats the Poles even worse afterwards to punish them and prevent another uprising in the future. Furthermore, we have a Russia to punish. More than likely, Britain is amongst the victorious powers, and as the most powerful great power, would take the lead in the peace process. Now here, Lord Palmerston becomes interesting, who dominated British foreign policy for more than 30 years, from 1830 to 1865. Importantly, that means he led British foreign policy during the historical Crimean War, and we know how he thought of Russia and the peace deal which he might have imagined from such a treaty. Russia was considered terrifying for many in Europe during the Victorian era. Their population was far greater than the other great powers, while both real and imagined threats of Pan-Slavism threatened to give Russia a massive sphere of influence. Importantly for Britain, Russian expansion into Central Asia also threatened their crown colony, India. Basically, if it was possible, Palmerston had plenty of motivation to try and cut Russia down to size, weakening the most threatening continental power and thereby safeguarding British hegemony. Specifically, Palmerston had hoped to invite nations like Sweden, Prussia and Austria to the anti-Russian coalition, with post-war plans to free Poland, give Romania to Austria, expand the Ottomans into the Caucasus, give Finland to Sweden, and perhaps most notably, expand the Prussians along the Baltic coast. It is easy to see those themes become reality after an alternate conflict. Prussia may indeed reach even further towards the Baltic. Russia may be driven even further into humiliation and isolation. Clearly and decisively driven to a corner, seemingly surrounded by hostile powers. Quite possibly, such a loss further entrenches Russia as a distrusting, militaristic state, out for revenge on those European powers which so wronged them. With that, let's put a pin into that timeline for a little bit, but we will return to it later, as we discuss the revolutions of 1848, the most pivotal year in near all Victorian-era alternate histories. France saw a Republican revolution overthrow their monarchy, the German Confederacy was all but dissolved due to revolutions in Germany, while Italy was rocked with pro-unification revolts in Austrian territory and pro-republican revolutions in the pre-existing states. Perhaps most importantly of all though, the Hungarians revolted, hoping to assert their independence from the Habsburg Empire. Crucially, Russia was spared from the revolutions of 1848, as their economy and society were behind the rest of Europe. As such, they had a lot of leverage during this period. But the Russian Tsar, Nicholas I, did not use this opportunity to, for example, join forces with the Hungarians and help collapse the Austrian Empire, giving them a free hand in later invasions of the Balkans. Instead, Russian forces intervened against the Hungarians, restoring Austrian rule without asking for anything in return. Even more, Prussia was attempting to restore a smaller German confederation without Austria, and thus dominated by the Prussians. When Austria's internal problems were solved, they turned their attention to Prussia. A war loomed over the issue, but again, Russian support for Austria ensured Prussia had to back down. Despite the potential for massive shakeups in 1848, a united Italy, a free Hungary, a Prussian Germany, in reality, little had actually changed when all was said and done. Not, to a minor extent, due to Russia's interventions. So if we imagine the revolutions of 1848 with our alternate borders, we can imagine just how much of a stress test this would be for Eastern Europe. And the options are endless, with variations around Russian attitudes, Prussian strength, whether or not Poland revolts in 1848 or earlier, and whether or not we have already seen Prussia expand even further. So let's explore a couple of plausible outcomes, though of course many others are also possible. Continuing our timeline where Russia has lost a second war, we can presume this will also be a Russia which feels thoroughly disconnected from the rest of Europe, with little love for their great power peers. As such, it is unlikely that this is a Russia which helps Austria get Hungary under control. This could mean that Austria ends up losing or being forced to at least compromise heavily with the Hungarians. But even if Austria does succeed in defeating Hungary, the war will take longer, be more costly, and provide more opportunity for their rivals, for example Prussia, to achieve their own goals. We may end up in a scenario where Austria enters near collapse, while a strange German Empire stretches up to the Baltic. From here, history as we know it is just gone, and the latter half of the century is more than likely to be quite chaotic for Europe. Alternatively, the 1848 revolutions would also be the prime moment for the Russians to start a conflict, especially if the Poles also choose this year to launch a big independence war against Prussia. With France in political turmoil and Prussia and Austria in active conflict, this would be the best opportunity for Russia to overthrow the European order as created by the Congress of Vienna. Britain is the only power which may be capable of halting the Russian advance, but even then, their reliance on naval power means that if the Russians can seize the initiative and weaken the Germanic powers enough, then it will be difficult for Britain to reverse the advances made on the ground. In a strange timeline, this could lead to a rerun of the Napoleonic Wars, in which a reactionary Russia competes against Britain and a rotating field of coalition partners. But since the video is already rather long, let's just leave it at the possibility of a Russian victory. Hungarian independence is entrenched, but their radical republican government is unlikely to be an actual ally of the Russian Empire. Still, their existence benefits Russia in the short term, and possibly allows Russia to consolidate control over Austrian Poland as well. Nominally independent, the new Polish state nevertheless falls deep into the Russian sphere. With both Prussia and Austria crippled, the fate of Germany is left up in the air. Quite possibly, this could result in a historical proposal by 4 of the smaller German kingdoms actually being considered, wherein the German Confederation would be restored, but this time with more federalization, closer integration through a customs union, etc. In the face of the pressure from the east and the shedding of a lot of the non-German territories, this may lead into the creation of some form of actual united German Confederation, wherein Prussia and Austria are the dominant powers, but the minor kingdoms hold far more influence over confederal politics. Once more, Russia has overthrown the Congress of Vienna, and the future of Europe is once more left in the air. Of course, we could also assume that Europe still survives the revolutionary period in good condition, with Nicholas I of Russia still remaining committed to the protection of European conservatism and monarchy, rather than risking the overthrow of it to get control over Poland. They decide the risk is just not worth it, and the fear of another French Revolution looms too large. From here, I think it would be most interesting to skip forwards in the timeline all the way to 1914. Of course, it is insane to assume that European geopolitics by this point wouldn't be radically altered. Yet, I'm still interested in discussing how such a minor border change could have massive impact on the way the nations of Europe interact, even if it is completely unreasonable to suggest that history could so closely resemble our own after all the changes in the past century. Now, above all else, I want to talk about the potential this has to lead to a more peaceful Europe, potentially avoiding World War I altogether. This would mainly be based on an altered German-Russo relationship in this timeline. Specifically, while there is the potential of Russia seeing Germany as more of a target, the German side of the calculation may be most changed. The military calculations for any conflict between the states are completely different. In our timeline, Berlin was only 300 kilometers from the Russian border, and the Silesian industrial zone and Prussian heartland were within easy striking range. This fact, amplified by general Russophobia and fears of their rising industrialization and militarization, largely contributed to the outbreak of World War I when it did, as the Germans felt that if they waited too long, they would no longer be able to defeat Russia. Or at least, it would mean they couldn't defeat France before then confronting Russia. In the minds of the German leadership, the Schlieffen Plan, their only shot at victory, was slipping away. With these alternate borders, there are two possibilities for change. For one, it may embolden the Germans and their Schlieffen Plan, considering they now have far more of a buffer zone. The Russians rampaging through Poland doesn't concern the Germans all too much, so they may commit even harder to the offensive against France. This is unlikely to actually make the military difference, but it is a fun tidbit. Now, more interesting is the opposite. Because the Germans have more of a buffer zone, their fears of a modernizing Russia is reduced. German leadership feels less of a pressure to deal with Russia. Beyond that, it may dampen German desires for Eastern Lebensraum, as their hands would be more than full with just Poland, and they may learn that occupying hostile peoples is more costly than they may have anticipated. As a result of these factors, the Germans may not push for war in 1914, and France and Russia are unlikely to themselves start an aggressive war against the Germans, since Britain would never support them. If, and that is a major if, global geopolitics haven't been butterflied away completely, this seemingly minor border change may just prevent World War I as we know it. But with that, I think I've covered all I wanted to cover about this timeline. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.